Good morning, buenos dias. I'm Jason Marzek, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Asia and Arts Latin America Center, and I'm delighted to be kicking off today's event in partnership with the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies. This event is part of our new series analyzing understudied areas of U.S. regional collaboration that can fortify the United States as the region's diplomatic partner of choice. Not only is our collaboration important for hemispheric investment and development, but it acquires additional significance in an era of global geopolitical competition between the U.S. and the PRC. Frankly, just last week, Honduras switched its recognition from Taiwan to the PRC. In today's event and accompanying report with the Perry Center, we offer tangible improvements for U.S. humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts, which have surpassed $700 million per year in recent years. At the same time, today we'll look at the secondary geopolitical benefits of strengthening U.S. leadership in fields like disaster response. Joining us today are the report's co-authors, Admiral Craig Fowler and Dr. Pat Patterson, as well as Allison Lapp and Lena Gog. Admiral Fowler is an Atlantic Council Distinguished Fellow and former commander of U.S. Southern Commands, where he worked tirelessly to enhance Western Hemisphere security by building strong partnerships across the region in fields like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Dr. Pat Patterson is a professor of practice at the Perry Center, where he specializes in international humanitarian relief, civil-military relations, and security cooperation. Allison Lapp is the acting director in the Office of Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean at USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, with extensive experience in disaster operations and support. Lena Gong is a research fellow with the Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Program at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University. She's also an expert on China's overseas humanitarian assistance and foreign policy. Welcome all, and to our audience, please also feel free to drop the questions in the chat using the Q&A function. I'm also thrilled that we're offering simultaneous Zoom interpretation in Spanish, which is accessible via the globe icon in the lower right corner of your screen. You'll also find the content of our reports in the chat right now, as well as on the webpage of the Atlantic Council. With that, I'm delighted to turn it over to my friend, Paul Angelo, Director of the Perry Center. Paul, great to have you with us, and over to you.
Thank you to Jason and to the entire team at the Atlantic Council for this opportunity to collaborate on such an important report, Weathering the Storms Together. I hope this is just the beginning of a fruitful partnership between our two organizations. And of course, I'm grateful to our two authors, Admiral Fowler and Dr. Pat Patterson. I'm delighted to see the US Navy so well represented here. I wouldn't have it any other way. In fact, I had the distinct honor of serving under Admiral Fowler in 2021 in my Navy reservist capacity during Southcom's Joint Task Force Haiti response, an experience that most certainly informed several of the main takeaways of this report. All of that said, I don't think we could have brought together a better team to deliver such an important and timely research project. I'd also like to acknowledge all of our Perry Center alumni on the call. In recent weeks, I visited Costa Rica, Colombia, and Mexico, where HADR and environmental security issues have come up as top priorities for our partners and our alums. And next week, I will be in Guatemala and Honduras for similar engagements. As always, I thank our alumni community for your enthusiasm and your commitment to working with the Perry Center and with the US government on developing shared solutions to shared problems. And in that vein, I'd like to use this opportunity to advertise some of the relevant programming the Perry Center is sponsoring in the weeks to come. In May, we have our first ever Climate Change Implications for Defense and Security course, in which we will bring together 50 students from over 20 countries across Latin America and the Caribbean for what will be our first in-person bilingual course in many, many years. In June, likewise, under the direction of Dr. Patterson, we will be sponsoring a virtual HADR course, which may be of interest to many people on the call. And in that same month, we will be participating in and supporting the work of CEPRODENAC of the Central American Integration System, Southcom and Northcom in a regional simulacro in the country of Panama, which I think goes to recommendations numbers 6 and 8 of the report, that the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies is a valuable ally and a point of reference for HADR education and dialogue, not just for our partner nations, but also for the US workforce. This is a growth area of which I am tremendously proud, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in the months and the years to come. So just with that, I will reiterate my appreciation and my congratulations to the authors, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for joining us. The Perry Center truly is a cornerstone of understanding and promoting U.S. engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean. We really are appreciative of our partnership with you, and we look forward to working together again in the future. Welcome to everybody. My name is Wazir Mel. I'm an Associate Director of the Caribbean Initiative here at the Adrian Arce Latin America Center. Thank you for joining us. Those of us joining virtually, we're happy to have you tuning in. Also, a special welcome to our distinguished speakers. Really excited for today's conversation. And it's a conversation that comes at a critical moment for the region. Extreme weather events plague the region. Just in the past few years, we've seen strong hurricanes batter many countries, along with earthquakes and even volcanic eruptions. These are all events that necessitate working with partners to provide humanitarian assistance and disaster relief to save lives in the region. Beyond this, HADR is a year-round effort and one that contributes to the foundation of a strong US-LAC partnership. This is all the more important with hurricane season just a few months away. And for today's discussion, puts it in a really timely spot. And we'll cover a few very important themes. We'll look at the importance of HADR for Latin America and the Caribbean. We'll look at some of the existing HADR activities in the region, both from the United States and others, before looking at how partners can better implement HADR mechanisms in the region. So to begin, I'll go across all of our speakers, starting with Admiral Fowler, a very broad question. First is, why does HADR even matter? And why does it matter particularly in the Western Hemisphere? I'll start with Admiral Fowler and then move on to Pat, Allison, and then Lena.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for dialing in today. And thanks for the collaboration with the Atlantic Council and the Perry Center to bring this important, vitally important topic forward into a meaningful report and conversation. It is so important. It's life and death. And these weather events, violent storms, volcanoes, earthquakes are increasing in frequency. They're impacting people globally, and particularly here in our neighborhood. And why it matters here is because it is our neighborhood. Think about all the things that characterize a neighborhood: close personal ties, cultural bonds between people and countries, proximity, distance matters. Many of the storms that sweep through the Caribbean end up hitting the US mainland. So we're tied in so many ways that we have to get this right and invest for the future. We have examples of success in the past, but it's all about learning from those and looking ahead, acknowledging where we've done well as organizations and as partnerships, but also acknowledging where more work needs to be done, both in terms of policy, law, education, resources, funding. So I look forward to the conversation, and I look forward to seeing the results.
Thank you, Admiral Fowler. Dr. Patterson, please go ahead.
Right. Thank you for the question. Before I answer it, I'd just like to say, as Admiral Fowler did, thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting this important discussion and research. And I'd also like to recognize Sydney Knapp, who's the research assistant that I've worked with for quite a while here at the Perry Center, who did a tremendous amount of data collection and analysis to really dive deep into these issues. A lot of complex, nuanced issues went into the report, and Sydney gets credit for a lot of that. I'd like to echo what Admiral Fowler said, is that this is absolutely one of the most critical issues in Latin America and the Caribbean. There's no surprise, I think, to anybody who's online with us today, how many Atlantic hurricanes or droughts or forest fires, even sea level rise are afflicting the Americas. And this is our neighbors in the region. And so we have a moral obligation to respond. And as the Admiral described very well, if we were living on a street in a community and there was a fire on a house down the street, all the neighbors gathered together and respond as promptly as possible to try to save lives and prevent the damage that's about to occur. The United States has an immense ability to respond promptly with a significant force. And those first 48 or 72 hours after an event happens, it's usually chaos. And we have a lot of expertise on the audience today, and many that we've consulted for the report. We know that getting assistance to the emergency zone right away can really help save lives and alleviate the suffering. And then it's a long process of restoration and reparations and stuff that required after the event occurs. So absolutely an important moral obligation, and also, as Jason Marzak mentioned in his opening remarks, a geopolitical competition going on in the region today. And we certainly have nothing against the Chinese people, but the People's Republic of China has some an agenda that's very different from the United States. And there's lots, of course, written about that. And so what we're trying to do is just make sure that the United States remains the first partner of choice in the region. And we demonstrate that through the goodwill that we offer during these events.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson. Community building, rapid response, similar to what Admiral Fowler spoke about, all essential elements that we'll cover in today's conversation. But I'll turn it over quickly to Allison and then Dr. Gan for their thoughts as well.
Yes, good morning, and thank you, as my colleagues thanked you, for convening us today to provide a little bit of a chapeau for the region. Countries across Latin America and the Caribbean experience a range of natural hazards, including droughts, earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, landslides, volcanic eruptions, and wildland fires. And for USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, we also provide assistance in response to ongoing violence or prolonged economic and political crises. So this includes contexts like Colombia, Haiti, and Venezuela. Furthermore, the impacts of climatic shocks, displacement, and rising inflation rates have exacerbated food insecurity, protection challenges, and other humanitarian needs in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So these complex emergencies and natural disasters have driven the continued need for humanitarian assistance across Latin America and the Caribbean. I think we enjoy broad support kind of across the aisle in Congress and in what we hear from the American people, that we do as a US government have a moral and policy imperative to provide support to these neighboring countries when crises hit there. As my colleagues have said, this is really the United States backyard. And when we show up, when we save lives and alleviate suffering and mitigate kind of the social and economic impacts of disasters, it really puts on display the best of what the American people can do. So I think that is why it's critically important for us as an interagency to remain engaged in the region.
Thank you, Allison. And Dr. Gong, over to you.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. Thanks to the organizer. As my fellow speakers already mentioned, the different types of importance of HADR. I just want to add one additional point. It is that HADR also can be a channel for cooperation. Although we have seen this area has become increasingly competitive, but experience from the Asia Pacific in the past 3 decades, especially after the Cold War, is that it has been used as a channel for Southeast Asian countries or the regional organization ASEAN to build regional cooperation, to cooperate with different extra-regional partners from the United States to China to Japan, South Korea, India, etc. So it is able to bring different parties together, as what we have seen after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. After the tsunami, we have seen progress in the peace talk in the Aceh province of Indonesia. So there is hope, like, to bring everyone together, to still work together. Yeah, that's my input. Thanks.
Thank you. And that cooperation element is extremely essential, going back to rapid response and who can get there first and provide life-saving mechanisms is definitely critical for the region. Admiral Fowler, I want to go back to you. I mean, somebody that's has such a unique perspective, having been to the region, so many times in your, while you were commander of Southcom and leading many of these sort of disaster relief task forces. How do you think HADR coming from the US is shaping the region's perception of the United States specifically?
Thank you. I want to point out the connection to a couple things that Allison and Lena said. One, the partnerships here. So the partnership with the region through HADR is real, it's tangible, it's delivering results. That partnership is led by Allison's team at USAID BHA, and the partnership that they have and the spirit of cooperation that they infuse in all relevant players is making a difference. And I had such a great, wonderful partnership with Allison and the team, and a long time Central America and Caribbean hand, Tim Callahan, who actually works in the region. It's just fantastic. And then the point that Lena made about cooperation, it's so true. We started this study looking at through the lens of great power competition, and Pat mentioned that. And to see what we could learn from what the Chinese approach is globally, and then where we might sort of compare and contrast that with the US. But it didn't take us long to realize that that's not really a lens. We're not in a competition here, well, only in the sense to save lives. So the best way to do that is working together and winning. And I think this is an area where we look forward in how we manage that US-China relationship and the broader global community. This is an area that I really think is a key area to look for places to cooperate and show that we can work together. So why does it matter? So I'll take Hurricanes Ida and Iota in November of 2020. It was officially declared after the hurricane season. We'd had our unofficial hurricane season over coffee at Southcom, and then two major hurricanes strike almost the same path across Central America, Caribbean, from hit regions like the Colombian Islands into the region, and just led devastation. And so what we saw is this international community, the non-government organizations, other nations, USAID leading the charge, the US military bringing its unique capabilities to bear, and the fact that we have assets in the region at a small forward operating base at Sotocana, Honduras, and long-standing relations. We see this making a difference because speed matters, that first 48 hours that Pat talked about. And so while there may be a perception in some circles that a US Army helicopter flying over Central America would be perceived as a negative thing, I mean, in most of our lifetimes, this is a region that was beset with civil war. It is not seen as a negative thing, because while militaries develop capabilities to ultimately deter war, bringing power, when they involve themselves with government agencies like USAID, BHA, really high quality NGOs like World Hope or Spirit of America, and work hand in hand with the UN, people see that Army helicopter, they see a handshake, they see an outreach of help, and the same fundamental survival instincts that we all have for our own families, we extend to our global family, and we make a difference and save lives. And we see nations and people come closer together as a result, despite the tragedy. And so that's the blessing and the beauty behind what we do when we work together effectively to make a difference in HADR.
Thanks, Admiral Fowler. And just following up on that point, I'm going to go to Dr. Patterson now. You gave a really good example of how U.S. military has adapted, right, and has helped change the perception on the ground within the region. So, Dr. Patterson, how else do HADR policies need to adapt, as we know that climate change is going to get worse, as we know that extreme weather events are only going to become much more frequent? How is that adaptation going to happen?
Thanks for raising that issue about climate change. I think it's absolutely critical that we understand the dangers that are approaching. Things are already tough in a region that's prone to a lot of these natural disasters, and it's going to get really challenging as the global temperatures continue to warm. So everything that we do and all of these efforts that the United States makes and the regional partners make are really going to have to be well honed and ready to respond as the meteorological and environmental conditions continue to worsen. We won't have more hurricanes according to the NOAA forecasts, but the hurricanes that we do have will be more often major category hurricanes and carrying about 10 to 15% more rainfall. All that leads to additional landslides. There will be more heat waves occurring in the region and a whole range of additional problems that we're going to have to face in the future. So not only the United States HADR team and enterprise, but also the regional efforts are really going to have to be on their A game all the time in order to be ready for this. I personally believe, Waz, that this is going to require a mobilization unlike any of the countries in the region have seen perhaps ever in their history before. It's going to require a team effort from the national disaster offices, the civil defense forces, the security forces, both the military and the police are going to play major roles in that. And it's probably going to require a pretty significant transformation in the way we do business as well. Instead of HADR being an important mission, it might be the top tier mission because these things are going to happen so frequently. So I think in sum, we're going to see a growing scope and magnitude of HADR requirements because of global temperatures that are warming the planet.
Thanks, Dr. Patterson. Really, really great points. Allison, I want to go back to you really quickly. Admiral Fowler brought up some really good points, really tangible points on HADR and its effectiveness in the region. And as mentioned, that USAID is a huge leader in this field. So from your vantage point, what are some of the key activities that USAID is undertaking in LAC with respect to HADR?
Yes, thanks for the question. I think we are there kind of when the event hits, but we are very committed also in our steady state between major catastrophes to work very closely with countries and communities in the region to build resilience and preparedness for the next event, particularly remaining cognizant of kind of the increasing vulnerabilities in an environment where climate change continues to be a major concern. But I think at the same time, recognizing that these are sophisticated countries which are becoming ever more capable of handling events that occur within their borders because of the years of investment that we have put into kind of building up their FEMA equivalents, their kind of national disaster management agencies through training and capacity building. So some examples along those lines, Admiral Fowler mentioned our fantastic partnership with Joint Task Force Bravo in Sotocano during Hurricanes Eta and Iota a couple years ago. We like to take a look at how those two very devastating hurricanes compared with Hurricane Mitch, which hit Central America in a very similar fashion, but actually with lower wind speeds and a lower overall amount of rainfall in 1998. What had changed between 1998 and Hurricane Eta and Iota was we had worked with the Central American governments to put in place kind of an end-to-end flood warning system there, which allowed messages to get out to communities in the impact of these hurricanes, so that between Mitch, which caused 10,000 deaths and very significant economic losses, and then Eta and Iota in 2010, where the deaths were 205 and economic losses were lower. That was still tragic, but that kind of investment in local governments and local communities, I think, really puts us ahead of the curve in between disasters. And I think another piece of the work that we do that I would highlight is our large-scale training program that we have in place, which is called the Regional Disaster Assistance Program, which over a couple of decades has trained 85,000 first responders across Latin America and the Caribbean on a range of topics to include kind of emergency operations center management, urban search and rescue, wildland fire, et cetera. And that kind of cohort of folks that we have trained then go back to their host governments and host communities and train others in the first responder community, and sort of cascading out that knowledge and expertise really does put us on stronger footing as the actual hazards themselves become more catastrophic.
Thanks, Allison. I think what we're hearing is USAID is doing a lot of work and helping the region become much more self-sufficient. Because going back to Dr. Patterson's comment about rapid response, the first 48 hours, fastest way to help a country is when the country has the resources at its own, has resources in its hands to be able to do so itself. So, just throwing out this question both to Dr. Patterson and Admiral Fowler, how does that change sort of HADR policy going, into the future, right? As the region becomes a little bit more self-sufficient, how does it have to change the U.S.'s approach to the region? I'll ask you, Dr. Patterson, that, but Admiral Fowler, at a more broader level, we talked a little bit about the tangible aspects, and I love that you brought up that the partnership with the region is a tangible one, right? There's deliverables coming out of it. You can see it. physically see the changes that the U.S. is helping to make. But what does this mean for broader U.S. foreign policy to the region and hemispheric security as well? Really, HADR being a cornerstone of it. So I'll start with Dr. Patterson, then go to Admiral Fowler.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's an important one. I think the partners in the region that we work very closely with and have for generations understand that the United States is the partner of choice and will come to their aid when they need it. The relations between countries kind of ebbs and flows depending on the political winds. But the one thing that's always going to be constant is that there will be disasters and there will be a need for a rapid response to these issues. They can count upon the United States to be there no matter where or when it happens.
Thanks. Admiral Fowler?
The focus has been, and I really like the comparison Allison did with the devastation of the Hurricane Mitch and then what was learned from that and brought forward. The focus has been on building professional counterpart institutions and organizations that know how to do their missions. And for the military, that mission extends from combat to humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, logistics, law, legal aspects, and do it ethically and correctly. And we have invested in that through education and through exercises. And so there has been a tremendous improvement in the self-sufficiency, but these disasters and the severity and the increasing nature of the disasters will mandate that we all stay together and stay involved and stay invested. There's not one nation, not even the United States, that can handle these disasters alone. It has to be a complete team coming together. And I think we will look ahead and say, we'll be really glad we made the investments we're making today, and we should consider increasing those investments as we move forward. And the report highlights education as one area. When you peel it back, USAID's doing some tremendous work through their BHA and their courses. Southcom has a little bit that we plug into our exercise program, and think of exercise as a dress rehearsal for the real thing. Perry Center has one course, but that's about it. That is not sufficient to handle the breadth of all the organizations and their needs as we move forward. And the prevention is so key here, and education, and then turning that into exercises, dress rehearsal is one area that I think we need more investment in. Even though we see self-sufficiency increasing, we need to be in this together to meet the future.
That's great to hear. And I think we can use this, this report and this event, or it's really a call to action, is what I'm hearing. We're hearing the strength of extreme weather events are growing, the frequency in some cases are growing. This really needs to be a call to action. And Dr. Patterson, you talked about a mobilization of resources and capacity that we just haven't seen yet, right? And this is going to be extremely important, 5, 10, 15 years out. I want to turn the conversation a little bit. At the outset, Dr. Gon talked a lot about cooperation and collaboration, and I think that's been echoed throughout everything we've spoken about in this first half hour. The report specifically, it does highlight the U.S., but it notes that the U.S. is not the only country collaborating with Latin American and Caribbean partners with regard to HADR. These efforts are global. The report notes that beyond China, but Taiwan, Japan, Korea also assist many of these countries before and after natural disasters. In the Caribbean, particularly, we've seen Canada and the UK play important roles as well. But really honing in on the China part, I mean, that's a big conversation topic in the US, in Washington right now for a variety of reasons. But Dr. Gon, I want to ask you specifically, what are some characteristics of Chinese overseas HADR that we see both in LAC, but also worldwide as well? What are some of those common traits that they exist that characterize what Chinese HADR looks like?
I think there are a few features that I observed from China's past HADR efforts. The first one is their involvement or the focus on the less sensitive or controversial settings, such as natural disasters, food insecurity, or public health emergencies like epidemic Ebola in West Africa, etc. They were or used to be or still are reluctant or more conservative in dealing with conflict-related humanitarian situations. Although maybe 5 to a few years ago, they started to engage with UNHCR more than before. They supported their projects, etc. But still, it's not comparable with other major donors. That's one. And the second one is when they engage on humanitarian issues in conflict setting, they still focus on issues such as food, health, rather than those protection issues, which they have less experience dealing with. So the next point I'd say is that their focus, or they are more used to deal government to government channel or bilaterally. They also engage multilateral settings or multilateral mechanisms such as the UN or regional organizations. But these multilateral efforts only started to gain more momentum or interest maybe 5 to 10 years ago. And I think that's the general observations I have. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Kang. Really, really insightful and really great way to sort of contextualize a lot of what we've spoken about here today. Dr. Patterson, I want to go to you and based on the report, based on some of your analysis, what should readers take away from the report with regard to some of China's HADR activity in the region?
Yeah, China actually does very little HADR effort in the Latin America and the Caribbean as compared on a relative scale to the United States, which is a very large presence there to assist our partners in the region. We consulted some of the data out of William and Mary University down in Southern Virginia, their aid data program. And the People's Republic of China contributed $19 million of humanitarian aid over about a 12-year span, as compared to the United States, which spent over $740 million in 1 year in 2020. So that's about 40 times more bang for the buck that's coming from the United States taxpayers' pockets as compared to what's coming out of China. And of course, I think the big flagship of our efforts, humanitarian efforts in the region, are the USNS Comfort, one of our 2 hospital ships, which does regular deployments down there. During one of those last visits, the Comfort conducted had 20,000 patients and over 600 surgeries in a couple different countries that it visited. So it really is a vessel of goodwill that shows up on the horizon and demonstrates that it doesn't, a warship off the coast of a Latin American or Caribbean nation is not a bad thing, as the Admiral mentioned, because for our long portion of our history, that sometimes was represented in a different manner. So in addition to that, the humanitarian civic assistance programs are where we send doctors, U.S. military doctors, into remote locations that oftentimes might not see a lot of government presence. They do an immense amount of goodwill there, conducting basic medical events as well as surgeries in some cases. And this year, in 2023 alone, they'll be conducting 70 of those events in about 10 different countries in the region. So the United States is really an example, a model, I think, for many countries to demonstrate the goodwill that we can bring to the table, especially in a lot of areas that are still developing and need that kind of assistance.
Thanks, Dr. Patterson. Those are really interesting statistics and really good framing. The goodwill that the U.S. is building in the region, and it brings to mind how do you multiply that goodwill, and not just coming from the U.S. but working with partners that also have a vested interest in the security of the region. And Alison, I'll turn to you just really quickly. Who are some of the countries that the U.S., the USAID, is working with regard to HADR, and what have you seen that's been extremely successful? And then Admiral Fowler, I'll go to you for your own experience, having done great work in this field as well.
Thanks for that. I think while the U.S. is the largest donor in the region, we work quite passionately with our donor colleagues to kind of raise awareness, bring their attention, and of course, bring their support to a number of crises throughout the region. There are the ongoing crises that are kind of habitually underfunded. So kind of Venezuela, Colombia, Haiti come to mind. for that category, where we speak closely with our counterparts to the north, the Canadians, as well as some of the others that you mentioned, I think at the outset: Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and others in the broader region, to kind of try to bring greater investment from those countries. What we do is sort of talk through what are the greatest needs and comparative advantages, sort of sharing our plan before we make it public for what the US government will be contributing, and then letting our donor counterparts know that, hey, if the US is going to do this, this means that X, Y, and Z are still unfunded, and can you show up in a way that will make a difference to the people of this country? It's kind of an ongoing push and pull, where we attend high-level conferences, we bring in our UN counterparts, and try to sort of keep the drumbeat steady, even with the competing priorities that continue to pop up globally, with, you know, the Turkey-Syria earthquake that just happened, with Ukraine, with the Horn of Africa, all competing for donor funding. The countries in Latin America and the Caribbean remain a top priority for us, and one that we communicate out to our donor counterparts are a priority for us to see them partner with us in that set of countries.
Thanks, Allison. It's great to see, great to get your insight on how that collaboration is working. Admiral Fowler, I'll go to you for your own experience in working with partners.
Well, the Haiti earthquake in August of 2021 was of the same magnitude as the one that devastated Haiti in 2010, albeit a different location, which was less dense in terms of population, and resulted in the end less loss of lives. But when something happens like that, we don't know that at the beginning. We just know we need to respond. I think the biggest innovation is the step forward that relevant organizations have made together to take lessons learned, whether it's Mitch or the Haiti earthquake in 2010, and then apply those by putting into place agreements, procedures, discussions, conferences, tabletop exercises, which is a term of art we use to describe an exercise where we don't go out in the field and practice it, but we walk through it in a conference room or in a center. And we've used the virtual world to the advantage to have these extended discussions where we don't require people to travel as much. A big aha for me was in pandemic in 2020, we were forced to, for a period, very short period, take a pause in some of our annual conferences where we bring people together. And one in particular is the annual Southcom hosted Caribbean Security Conference. USAID plays a role there. We invite a large amount of players. The scenario we used in 2020 was a massive Haiti Cat 5 hurricane. Well, we didn't know the next year we'd have an earthquake of magnitude. A lot of the same skills and collaboration are required, whether it's an earthquake or a hurricane, in terms of initial speed of response and coordination and tracking things. One of the ahas was we invited the Caribbean Health Organization into our conference in 2020 because normally they would not have a budget to come in person. We normally wouldn't think to invite them. It's a civilian agency. And it was pretty clear that there were conversations happening across organizations, even amongst Caribbean nations and Central American nations, with health organizations, while pandemic specific, that hadn't occurred in a while, and connections that needed to be made irrespective of what the next disaster was. So we have got to keep learning. We've done, I never want to say that we've done a good job. We've done an okay job of getting to where we are. We've got to accelerate that into the future so we're ready for the next thing, which will happen.
Thanks, Admiral Fowler. Really great points on the lessons learned, needing to accelerate. Allison talking about the push and pull between working with partners. Admiral Fowler bringing up the virtual component. I think that goes to something we talked about earlier on sort of adapting to a different environment, HADR policies, adapting. But Dr. Gong, I want to go back to you. Listening to what Allison and Admiral Fowler mentioned, what are some of those lessons learned that Asian countries that are working in the region can apply, right? From your vantage point, how can they be a more effective partner to Latin America and the Caribbean with regard to HADR?
From the Asian experience, I think the first important lesson we learned that any mechanism or cooperation is better led by the region itself. This is the case in Southeast Asia. Now the region has developed a quite, at least relatively good capacity to respond to disasters within the region. They have a regional coordination center for HADR. And then within the regional organization of ASEAN, they also have this coordination center to coordinate international assistance coming to the country affected by disasters. And this is also the lesson learned, I think, Joe, from the response to the Tonga double disasters last year. And they are now discussing a regional HADR coordination center, and an expert based in Australia also mentioned that it is very important that this center is regionally led and located in one of the regional countries or the regional organization there. So I think a very important lesson is regionally led. And another one I suggest is that you coordinate with related stakeholders regularly, like through exercises, you stay in touch, because in some organizations, there is quite a high turnover rate. So people change roles or rotate among different postings. It is very important to know who you are working with rather than just an email. It is better to have a direct contact line rather than just an email. So I think that's the 2 points I find very important and also mentioned in the report. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Gong. I mean, region-led, I think that is an extremely important point that you're bringing up, and one that has really characterized a lot of this conversation. Admiral Fowler, I want to go to you, and then I'll go to Dr. Patterson right after. From your time at Southcom, what Latin American Caribbean regional innovations regarding HADR were noteworthy to you? And bringing in the report, what some of the recommendations from the report itself, how can they help with some of those regional innovations?
The Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency that's being run by Dr. Elizabeth Riley, and she participated in our workshop for this, is an example of that regional organization that has stepped up and is doing an incredible job as a focal point for regional efforts, nations that working together and other organizations working together. And the partnership that regional organization has with USAID BHA, with Southcom, is strong and healthy. And to Dr. Gong's point, it's based on people knowing each other, meeting each other, visiting each other's facility, participating in workshops together, exercises together over years, and you get that the reps and sets, to use a sports analogy, necessary so that you can understand the capabilities and the authorities that each organization bring to bear. But I'll cite that one. Southcom invested and actually built the facility through exercise-related funds through the U.S. foreign assistance programs that helped SEDIMA come to life, the Caribbean Disaster Management Agency, their acronym. So I cite that as one. We can do more to pull into Central America, to pull in South America, to make a stronger regional hub of centers and groups working together for common cause.
Thanks, Admiral Fowler. That's a really good point on SEDIMA. I mean, particularly in the Caribbean, where human capital, there are limits to it. Partnerships with other organizations really do matter, whether it's about research. Research and data is a continuous struggle in the region, whether it's having resources, sharing technologies, expertise. So really great points there. Dr. Patterson, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll echo what Admiral mentioned already, is that there's some really powerful regional organizations as well as international organizations. And a lot of the emphasis that we placed in the report was exactly how we could strengthen those coordination efforts with UN Office of Humanitarian Assistance, UN OCHA, as it goes by. USAID already has some really strong links to their counterparts in the United Nations team, but there's also, as the Admiral mentioned, SEDIMA out of Barbados and SEPREDINAC out of Guatemala, moving back to Panama in just a few months. But there's a lot of, in order to avoid redundancies when every minute counts and every effort counts during these critical golden hours, 48 hours or 72 hours after a hurricane or another disaster strikes, everybody who's showing up at the emergency zone has got to be on the same page, using a common operating picture, using the same communications, the same data software, and really maximizing the response and the effectiveness of the HADR effort that's afoot. If we're all coming at it and none of the organizations are talking amongst one another, then there's going to be a lot of repetition and a lot of wasted effort and resources that could be better put to use. So as we went through all the data and consulted with a number of subject matter experts, the Admiral and I realized that the US HADR program is very well developed, but there's still room for improvement. Like any big organization, there are some reforms and innovation that can occur. And that's really what we try to drill down into, is identifying some of the gaps and deficiencies that exist. And working with regional and international partners is one of those areas that we can improve.
Thanks, Dr. Patterson. And I'm going to stay with you really quickly. Both the U.S. and the U.S. and Latin America and the Caribbean, the public is a key stakeholder for HADR activities. It's a beneficiary when these efforts work well. Unfortunately, a casualty when they don't. Using some of the recommendations from the report, how can which of our recommendations can be fortified by the American public or Latin American Caribbean public's activities and awareness of what's going on?
Yeah, we put a couple of recommendations based specifically on that question. The public-private partnership program is used by Southcom. It's very well developed, and we spoke to the representatives down in Miami about that. That can probably be enhanced a little bit more, perhaps through education and public awareness of it. The National Guard cooperative partnership with other countries is also a really powerful force that does tremendous amount of good work. There's other centers, like the Admiral mentioned, that we can work with. So there's a lot of room that we can really kind of heighten or fine tune a lot of the efforts that are being made with regional or international organizations. We put some of those recommendations into the report. And so now it's a matter of, instead of just advertising those gaps or those deficiencies, it's a matter of following up and actually putting into practice some of the areas that we need to improve upon.
Thanks, Dr. Patterson. And Dr. Gong, going really quickly to you, in your experience looking at the different Asian countries that have engaged in HADR activities, whether it's in Latin America, the Caribbean, or in different parts of the world, how have they sort of publicized or has raised awareness of the things that they're doing well and showing why it's important to the publics that they respond to? And do you think there's some lessons learned that we can apply to the region itself?
I think the first point is to engage local partners, to work together with them. And the second one is because there will be language issue. Sometimes they only have access to social media in local language. So it is very important to have local partners. And of course, publicity through social media, and make sure that information verification, like to make sure the information is correct and accurate, and deal with misinformation, disinformation timely is also very important. Yeah, so 2 points. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. So we've spoken a little bit, Admiral Fowler and Dr. Patterson both brought up some of the recommendations out of the report. And Allison, I'll turn to you now. Hearing some of these recommendations and being able to read through the report, what are some of the challenges to implementing our recommendations that you've noticed based on your own on-the-ground experience in humanitarian challenge situations, and how can we overcome these obstacles using increased partnership, community efforts, multilateral coordination with partners in the region?
Sure, thanks for that. I think I agree with a number of the recommendations themselves, particularly kind of around, as Dr. Patterson was saying, interoperability and sort of ensuring, even with basics like communication systems, that the left hand is able to speak to the right hand, so to speak. In what we call the fog of relief, kind of the early days after the event strikes, I think in terms of moving in that direction, some of it, and this is well underway, but is understanding kind of what the landscape is, what exists, what systems are in place, and figuring out, therefore, what is the tweak that needs to be made? Is it us changing our set of equipment in this example, or is it asking the partner to invest in something different? So I think getting that baseline and moving forward from there, kind of in the SEDIMA example, USAID BHA actually funds the UN World Food Program to enhance the capacities of SEDIMA and its 19 member states and territories to strengthen things like social protection systems, emergency telecommunications, and end-to-end humanitarian supply chain management throughout the year. We also pre-position relief supplies in key locations around Latin America and the Caribbean, to include Miami. So I think making sure that each piece of the US government interagency kind of knows what the overall picture is, the capabilities of our interagency partners, and then that we're having those conversations very actively and regularly during steady state times with our host nation counterparts. I think there are two other challenges that we are actively working through. One is kind of encouraging the governments of Latin American countries to streamline their disaster risk reduction and management related laws and policies to allow faster and kind of more efficient humanitarian assistance in the event of emergencies. So in some countries, humanitarian aid is subjected to upfront taxes or kind of other regulations that we are looking to work through with them to make sure that there is a regulatory environment that enables sort of quick action in the early days after a crisis. And then secondly, in the Caribbean specifically, we are supporting the adoption of kind of a disaster management structure and system called comprehensive disaster management, which is essentially an integrated approach to disaster management that incorporates the response for all hazards through all phases of the disaster management cycle. And we have sort of trained and built capacity on this for years and are at the point where we are asking our Caribbean counterpart states to sort of directly resource and fully operationalize the strategy. So I think just deepening and sort of building even greater ownership of some of those systems with our counterparts throughout the region.
Thanks, Allison. Two things really struck me. You were talking about the different key locations, and I have a question that I want to throw out to Admiral Fowler on, the Western Hemisphere is a massive space. And when we think about rapid response, going back to Dr. Patterson's comments at the top, how can the US work with partners to sort of leverage geography in a way to sort of increase rapid response? And then Dr. Patterson, I'll go to you really quickly in thinking about, Allison brought up Miami, and having lived in Miami myself, I know how frequently Miami is affected by strong storms and hurricanes. And what are some of the things that sort of Florida does well in responding to some of these extreme weather events that that you think that we can bring to the region or work with the region on? So Admiral Fowler, I'll start with you.
Militaries and security services bring unique capabilities to disaster response. The time to be ready is now, and it's capital intensive. You need planes and you need ships, airlift and sea lift, and trucks and other equipment in to take it over land. And that requires partnering with the relevant agencies and institutions in host nations, and then determining how they can get the resources and the training to one, acquire, procure the kit that they need, and then maintain it and keep it in action. And to do that, the U.S. State Department, other agencies have to work together so we don't duplicate needs, we identify needs, and we help host nation or regional organizations like RSS, Regional Security System in the Caribbean, get their kit funded. And sometimes U.S. laws that are meant to be helpful can block our own field goals, so to speak, in this endeavor. We'll put something in place and then we'll find out we can't do what we need to do to help somebody maintain a light lift plane or a helicopter. So the report makes some recommendations in that regard. And I think if those were enacted, would be meaningful for future response.
Thanks, Admiral. Dr. Patterson?
Yeah, I will add as well that, all these events occur on a hierarchy. So if there's a storm or a flooding that occurs in one region, it's the local forces first that respond to it, then the regional forces, and then eventually national forces get involved if it exceeds the capacity of the local and regional groups. And then finally, it reaches an international level. And as long as those practices across all four levels are well honed and well developed, then things should work the way they're supposed to. Now, that, of course, is easy to say, but it's much harder to put into practice because there's so much complex issues that go into responding effectively to a storm. And specifically, one of the questions you had about what Florida does well that other countries could benefit from is an early warning system. All the alerts that we get on our phones is a real luxury here in the United States, and it keeps us on our toes when there's storm lines rolling in, or heavy weather, or even hypothermia that we're experiencing up in Washington, D.C. during this season. And those just don't exist in a lot of the undeveloped or developing countries in the Americas. Chile has just, for example, after its 2015 quake, established that. And that led to the loss of a lot of lives along the Chilean coast when they had that massive storm off of Concepcion, or massive earthquake, and then tsunami off Talcahuano and Concepcion. So there's a lot of things like that that are relatively simple to put into place, but can save lives and alleviate suffering so that the people are prepared when the storm or when the threat is approaching.
Thanks, Dr. Patterson. I know we're running out of time. It's been a great discussion so far. I want to go to each of you really quickly, thinking 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. Give us some insight on what you expect to see. I'll go as far as say a prediction. Don't worry, we won't hold you to whether you're right or wrong when we check back in about 20 years. But what do you expect to see? How is HADR going to evolve? How is the U.S.-LAC partnership going to evolve in this space, and also with external actors as well? So, Dr. Gong, I'll start with you. Then I'll go to Allison, Dr. Patterson, then give Admiral Fowler the last word.
I think one very important trend we notice is that we're going to see more concurrent disasters, which means we are going to deal with not just one type of disaster, but maybe at the same time we'll have a natural hazard, natural disaster, have a pandemic, sometimes maybe a third type of disaster. So how we are going to deal with this kind of complex situation, or maybe in a conflict setting, as what we have seen in the Ukraine crisis, conflict or event of low probability can happen, and somewhere that used to be peaceful now is affected by armed conflict. So how we are going to deal with an increasingly complicated humanitarian situation is what we need to consider. Yeah.
Allison?
Thanks. Yes, I think we are faced with this dichotomy of kind of an outlook of stronger and perhaps more frequent climactic events, but countries that with our partnership are themselves becoming more self-reliant. So sort of understanding where we fit into that picture, which I think continues to be as a strong partner that is there from day one, ready to support of that host nation-led response. I think one other kind of new frontier that we've only scratched the surface on in this conversation is ways in which we can engage with the private sector and sort of bring in those resources a bit more robustly, both in the aftermath of a disaster, as Dr. Patterson noted, but also to invest in their own resilience and the resilience of the communities around them so that they're hit not quite as hard. But I'll pause there.
Thanks. Dr. Patterson?
Yeah, I like what Dr. Gong mentioned about the cascading effects, and I think we'll probably see more of that as the climate change continues to worsen the conditions around the region. So absolutely a lot to be done about that. And after traveling with Dr. Angelo for the last couple of weeks down to Costa Rica and Colombia and discussing this with some of our counterparts, the level of awareness of how bad things are going to get is just not there yet. So now is the time, as Diablo mentioned, we don't want to wait on this until the event is on us. We want to prepare for these kind of things and looking forward. And so now's the time to really hone our resources, practice all these tabletop exercises and collaborative efforts through international conferences and a lot of other stuff that Southcom brings to the table. Now's the time to do that as we think 5-10 years down the road and conditions continue to worsen. And even the cascading complexities, as Dr. Gong mentioned, will be happening more frequently.
Thanks. And Admiral Fowler, over to you.
It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And it will be more severe, it'll be more concurrent, and it'll impact more people and have a second and third order security effects that will hit people here in central Pennsylvania, where I am, or in Thailand or Singapore. So it's a global shared responsibility that we get this right. If we fast forward 10 years and we're writing the after action review of the next biggest event that happens in this hemisphere or somewhere else globally, we would be fortunate if policymakers, decision makers, and governments invested more in this type of resilience and prevention than less. And that starts with education. It starts with conferences, exercises, that we recognize the return on investment for this type of money, resources, time, that we would be fortunate and thankful that people solved the interoperability problems that Allison mentioned, that the report touches on, that plague some of our efforts to work together more effectively during a crisis. We will be fortunate if we write, and when we write that after action, that we had not allowed all the budget pressures that we see globally to push money towards higher end weapon systems that are going to impact the global competition that's called out national security strategy. That's certainly important, but we've got to make sure that resources are committed to being a good partner in the day-to-day competition. That's where we're going to win global peace and security in the future. It's each and every day. And thanks again to all of you and to the Perry Center and the Atlantic Council for working on this.
Thank you, Admiral Fowler. Really great conversation, truly an important one. We talked about coordination with partners, that being extremely key, this being a community effort, learning from each other. This event and this report being a call to action that we need to do more and accelerate what we're doing, and this being a whole government effort. It's capital intensive, like Admiral Fowler mentioned. Regulatory environment needs to be set, like Allison mentioned. So really a great conversation. And again, I want to thank the Perry Center for their partnership. Thank our two co-authors for their excellent analysis and insight. Please check out the report. And a special thank you to my colleague Isabel Bernhardt for coordinating this event, coordinating the report, and just doing an all-around great job. Thank you to everybody for joining us, and we look forward to speaking again in the future.